can start with our first speaker. Samar, over to you.
Well, thanks for having me and other panelists as well. I guess since I'm starting, I'm just going to give you a brief context of the war in Yemen, the conflict per se, and then the results of the humanitarian aspect. And then I'm sure that our panelists will also continue to talk about the conflict in depth through different lens. The war in Yemen started in 2014, which is very important because I had found that recently, pretty much not recently, I think even since the conflict has started, specifically in Western societies, they tend to start the war at a different date, which is presumed to be 2015 March 2015, when Saudi Arabia, it did intervene into the country. But actually the conflict started with a coup in 2014 September, specifically. This coup is run by the Houthi militias, which is an Iranian-based influenced militia armed group. And what they did was they traveled, or not traveled, but more so just took their arms and went from Sana'a all the way down to the south to occupy, which resulted in where we are today. So with that being said, I will kind of, as a result of conflict, the humanitarian aspect comes along a lot, especially in the West. I want to make clear that the humanitarian crisis in Yemen actually started prior to this conflict. It was just not as quickened with this conflict. In 2010 specifically, the economic situation in Yemen was disastrous. It was about 40 to 50% loss of jobs. Just so you're aware, Yemen is a country that has around 70% population of youth. And so this created a very big problem, which is why the Arab Spring came along in Yemen in 2011. And so our economic sector was really in a very horrendous situation. Now, within each sector, I think we have to kind of approach it in different ways. In the education sector, currently right now, there's around more than 2 million Yemeni children out of schools, which is causing a very big problem because that means that they're willing to do anything for survival, including child recruitment in conflict. And we've seen this especially in Sana'a as well. And so it's either, survival through combating or, death for that matter, whether it's the, lack of support financially, whether it's, hunger and things like that. Now, there's a sense of hopelessness. And so with that alternative, it gave them a route to kind of, give support to their families. Just so we kind of understand in terms of how and why the education sector has been impacted. The first is it's chronological. So when the conflict started, a lot of the Houthis had put in weapons in schools. Therefore, Saudi Arabia would then airstrike those schools as a say of that there's weapons in there. That then results in mass educational system being depleted. For the specifically for the health sector, I know that this is about politics and health. I recently came back from, not recently, although I wish it was in August 2019. I took a trip to Yemen for, just a field visit, and I specifically focused on the health sector. Currently, there's around more than half of Yemen's hospitals either closed or are lacking resources, which is a very big problem. There is actually items that are being used in these hospitals post-Soviet Union. So you'll actually see items that companies that we used to have even in the US have closed decades ago. You have no operational supports, which I'll go into a little bit more, especially from the INGO aspect. And you have COVID, which is a new problem in Yemen. Now, regarding COVID, specifically in Yemen, you have, because of different authorities on the ground, you have different systems in place. In Sana'a, you would find Houthis or Houthi-led Ministry of Health actually kind of hiding the cases to show some sense of political strength, that they're in control of this disease, that this actually, or this virus, I'm sorry, is actually a Western conspiracy. So they're actually trying to control it in that way. Although in reality, mass graves have been full. A lot of graveyards have been closed because of just the mass amount of deaths happening. Hospitals are full. And also the medical staffs of hospitals are complaining that they're not getting any PPE, even though organizations like WHO have been sending these aid shipments to Sana'a a couple of times already, and we still haven't, they still have not been given anything on the ground. In the south of Yemen, or what you would call central and south, run by the Hadi government, you would actually see that there is some sense of system in place when it comes to public records of COVID cases. But one of the biggest problems with this is that Yemen has not been supported with resources and tools for COVID. There's around 6 PCR machines, and these machines are the only machines that actually test COVID for a population of 30 million, which is pretty horrendous in my opinion. Testing kits, roughly less than a couple of thousand so far. Essentially, when COVID did start, there was about 300 testing kits only. This was probably in late March, early April. And so that really caused a very big number in terms of very big problem when it came to the numbers, official numbers. So what you actually see in Yemen is whatever the number may be, it's most likely not the real official number. There's just a lack of support. Now, one of the biggest problems with the health sector right now, it's really depleted. I would actually argue that it's almost non-existent in some sense. The operational support is zero. So we have a problem with INGO mechanisms being placed for humanitarian standard aid. One, for example, would be that WHO or any other UN agency would, for example, give a hospital a few ambulances to kind of get the EMS services in place. But actually, in reality, when you actually visit these hospitals, these ambulances are on the side being rusted in the sun because they cannot operate them. And so this is a very big gap that we're trying to kind of tackle when it comes to the humanitarian situation. Now, for the economic and infrastructure sector, again, this is all about economics when it comes to humanitarian. There is a great amount of food in Yemen. And I guess somebody, and maybe myself, will touch upon what you would call the siege in Yemen, which assumes to be blocking certain ports. And I'll clarify that a little bit later. The World Bank estimates about $15 billion worth of economic loss. And actually, as the conflict continues, if it continues up to 2022, the country will be set back 26 years. So that's a very, very big problem. Now, I always have to kind of mention that mismanagement of state institutions play a big role in this as well, obviously. And from either side, there are they politicize humanitarian aid. And unfortunately, when, for example, when the city of Aden, which is the temporary capital currently, requests certain items from WHO, they actually send it to Sana'a. And we've seen a couple of times, and I was actually in Yemen during this time when they were requesting a few things. And so there's a politicizing of humanitarian aid that needs to be addressed, especially when it comes to UN agencies. And I think INGOs have a very, very powerful position in place to influence, political actors on the ground in a way that smoothens the standards of aid. Rather, what we're seeing is that it's actually the opposite, that they're influencing them to actually be stronger, what you would call bullies, rather than playing an active role in, neutralizing the respective IHL, international humanitarian law. I will have to kind of touch upon that we have to understand that standardizing humanitarian aid is a very big problem in Yemen. And I think we need to tackle this. And I also see this in Syria and other countries as well, that organizations have been attempting to kind of temporarily soothe the situation in a way where it's short-term projects. I always think that reapproaching humanitarian aid is really important. So sustainable development. In Yemen, unfortunately, there is two sides of this problem, which is urgent intervention versus sustainable development and rebuilding livelihood. And I feel like the country is in the mix of two right now. They're sandwiched. So depending on the area and the region, you do have to approach a certain way of projects. So with that being said, I want to kind of maybe leave all the questions till later so that everyone can can comment freely, but that is basically just the rough and very quick update on the humanitarian aspect, and we can go into detail a little bit more.
Thank you so much. So we can now pass it on to Nisma.
Thank you, Samar, for giving this very detailed information about how the health system is. For me, I will be speaking roughly about how is the situation in COVID, about the peace process and the role of women, and the role of women with the response for COVID, and also the effect of COVID on women, and my personal story being a woman on the ground during the COVID. So now when we're talking about the situation of COVID-19 in Yemen, we're talking about it's very difficult because it comes with the political problems and also the natural disasters that has been happening. So it was very difficult, to tell people to wash their hands when they don't have water in many places in Yemen, or even if they do have water, this water could be contaminated with sewage water due to the floods and the lack of infrastructure. We also could not tell people to stay at home because many of them are displaced and they have nowhere to go. So it was difficult. It was even more difficult to tell someone that his livelihood depends on the daily wages that you would stay at home. This stay-at-home orders were pretty much luxury for many of people in Yemen. What Yemen really needs right now is the end of war and looking towards a solution. We as women have been calling for a ceasefire since day one, even before the UN Secretary General have called for the global ceasefire. Women inside and outside Yemen have been calling for the end of the war since day one. As we welcome the international call for the ceasefire, we really hope that these calls are reflected into actions on the ground. I would like to touch base on, as the STRAC initiative, what are we doing on the ground? So we are a feminist-led organization working directly with the peace process. We are regularly holding consultations with track 2 partners on the ground that feeds in directly to the peace process. And recently, these consultations that we have been holding were feeding to the ceasefire agreement that has been going on the ground. So what we saw that unfortunately the UN-led process is excluding us as women and other women's organizations and also civil society, which led that we on the 10th of July, last Thursday exactly, we have shared the joint declaration. For those of you who don't know the joint declaration is the draft of the ceasefire agreement that the UN Envoy Office has been working on with the conflict parties. We shared it along our analysis and recommendation, and this was because we really need to feel that the peace process is a transparent process, is inclusive, and is also accountable. because in hard times like this is what we need. When it comes to the COVID response, I would like to say that women were the first one on the ground. So we have saw how women, even before the first cases were confirmed, they have trained the first respondents. Women have collected funds and equipped the health clinics and the health facilities. Women individuals, groups, and organizations have also led raising awareness campaigns online and offline. This impact of as women have been, doing this amazing work on the ground, also COVID-19 has a very hard impact. Not only that GBV has increased, but also our ability to protect women have decreased very much. For example, we at Peace Track Initiative, we have our protection program, which is, I could say, the least funded program we have. We do protection for women peace builders and women human rights defenders. While this limited resources have become even more limited when many donors have decided that to switch funds from protection into COVID-19. It was very painful for us to turn down those women who were released from the detention. Those women have experienced torture, sexual abuse, different, every ugly thing you could imagine. And those women were in desperate need for the funds to be able to relocate for somewhere safe. At the end, I would like to say that as someone who has been living in Yemen since day one, when war broke, when natural disaster happened, when the COVID-19 pandemic was at its peak, the situation in Yemen, I would say, literally became unbearable to live. So people, I have seen how they are devastated from the continuous and prolonged conflict. People are not able to meet ends because many of them their salaries are not even enough due to the increase of prices, the currency implementation, floods, and lack of investment with infrastructure, as Summer said, has led to very much disastrous situation. And on top of this, we have COVID, where people have lost the ability to access life-saving services like hospitals, because most of them, they are either damaged or under-equipped. And we have doctors who lost their lives because they don't have enough protection gear. In addition to the fact that in many places around Yemen, doctors who work in the public sector, they're not being paid their salaries. So there are different layers when it comes to the situation and the added up misery, I would call it. In addition, that after the spread of COVID, we have witnessed a very serious shortage of medicines and even vitamins. So also, unfortunately, an addition of the misery for, I could say, the situation and for the Yemeni citizen is the continuous instability. We have on the ground the state actors and non-state actors are fighting a lot. For example, in Aden, when there were the discussions about whom will be taking lead the COVID recovery center at Al Amal Hospital, they spent weeks and weeks instead of investing and equipping this center. The weeks were spent for conflicting about who is going to manage this center. And at the end, the decision was turned into that this center will be managed by an international NGO, which is a temporary solution. But what the people in Yemen really needs is the state acts like an actor that would provide the services. This is what I would like to touch base for now. I will leave things for later if anyone has questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasma. We can now pass it on to Nadia.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So I am looking at the war more generally, less so in connection to COVID-19, but I do think that the reason that COVID-19 has hit Yemen so difficult, so devastatingly, is because of the war. So the war in Yemen has many different complexities, as people have alluded to already. Ultimately, it was kicked off by the Arab Spring, but negligence of various communities in Yemen had been brewing discontent for decades. People have been on the streets for decades, and powerful states intervening in Yemen have continued to ignore these complexities, pursuing their own interests and ultimately denying the Yemeni people of their right to self-determination. Now, I should also state that often some political commentary around Yemen reduces the war simply to foreign actors recklessly intervening. However, Yemen has its own internal conflicts that are real and have been disregarded. The grievances are real, people have suffered, and ignoring this does not help. I think a big problem facing Yemen is the lack of nuance with which the international and humanitarian community approach the war, as well as mainstream media. And when I say humanitarian, I mean more large NGOs that are involved in the country. Currently, my thesis, I'm currently completing a master's, my thesis is on South Yemen independence and the barriers to it. And in my research, I found that the conversation is often predetermined. There is a consistent view that Yemenis just can't look after themselves and they need external help, without acknowledging that a big reason that we are where we are today is because of outside intervention, manipulating the situation to keep Yemen in line. The problems facing Yemen are reduced to violence and humanitarian concerns without looking at the political complexities that underlie these issues. Yemenis have been denied agency and the ability to be complex for far too long. And by that, I mean not that they aren't complex, but that they aren't viewed as having complex lives and experiences. International organizations such as the UN are also complicit in this through their failed attempts at a peace process that are largely failing because they're ignoring many of the parties involved in the war and are pursuing the reinstatement of the so-called legitimate government that was undemocratically elected to begin with. This to me is indicative that democracy and liberation are not at the heart of this peace process. Ignoring huge populations of the country will not lead to sustainable peace. To the groups that I'm going to focus on are women and the South. The Southern movement is hugely important when evaluating the current situation. Many commentators and international organizations are ignoring them or skirting around the issue, but their grievances have been persistent since unity in 1990. The Southern Transitional Council have effectively taken control of large sections of South Yemen, and people have been on the street in their millions in support of Southern independence for decades. And people in the South have faced specific discrimination, underfunding, and abandonment that has severely affected their quality of life for a long time. Their goal of independence is thus unsurprising and should be properly addressed. It has been shown through previously failed attempts at reaching a peace agreement that ignoring the South is unviable. I would ask that people question why powerful bodies and states are ignoring this question and continuing to malign those who are persistent in raising this issue. The Southern question will not go away. Now, looking at women, as I am an organizer with the South Yemeni Women's Forum, which is based in the UK, I obviously have a focus on Southern women, but I can extrapolate out a little bit. Women need to be involved in the peace process meaningfully at every level and from the beginning. This includes women from the South who are often vastly underrepresented amongst the women who do have access to the ear of the international community. Without including women from across the country, be it South or otherwise, we risk perpetuating the harm and erasure of the specific issues facing these communities. Moreover, women are facing specific violence and disruption in Yemen. Family units are being irreparably damaged, as the effects of the war are killing family members, and many women are now newly becoming heads of households, and there obviously were some before that. Pregnant and lactating women are struggling to provide for their children and safely have enjoyed their pregnancies due to the food crisis across the country. Women are stepping up and running communities as men go to fight, or they are joining men on the front line to protect their communities and their autonomy. More broadly, Yemen has been ranked the worst country in the world in the Global Gender Gap Report produced by the World Economic Forum for 13 consecutive years. Without meaningfully engaging women, many of these issues won't be addressed, and women will continue to suffer from this war and beyond it. I'd also be remiss if I didn't talk about COVID-19, which has devastated Yemen because of the infrastructure being decimated by the war, the health infrastructure, and obviously other infrastructure such as food and security, which devastate the impact upon those communities facing it. And they need a resolution. The need for resolution to this war has never been more urgent. In terms of what can be done, first and foremost, there needs to be a political solution. Without properly addressing the various grievances across the country, especially in the south, there will not be peace. People have come too far and fought too long to simply be offered the inadequate structures they had in the past and to not be heard on their particular issues. The history is too deep and has traumatized too many to be ignored. The South must be a part of the process, and the idea of self-determination and independence must be meaningfully engaged with. Specifically, the people of the South must be consulted, and solutions must have their specific experiences in mind. Representatives of the South need to be given room at the table, or the very real issues of representation, liberation, and marginalization will persist. Furthermore, meaningfully involve women across the spectrum. Research shows that engaging women in peace-building processes leads to more sustainable peace, which should be everyone's goal. This includes involving women who aren't politicians. Everyday resistance and survival is the reality of so many, and they need representing. Their voice matters too. They're keeping communities alive, and they need to be heard. In a war that has decimated much of the country and taken down the institutions of the state, this presents a real opportunity to center women in the creation of a new democratic process. The Kurdish struggle is a good example of women being centered and producing democratic structures that are rooted in local advocacy and engagement, centering the power at the grassroots and focusing on addressing women's inequality. We can learn from these struggles when looking at our future. Just to go back to the idea of everyday resistance and survival, there are things that can be done to reach those women who aren't involved in political structures or involved in political parties, or even involved in other formal organizations. Things like, thinking about childcare, thinking about what are their responsibilities and how can we make it easier for them to get involved, and things like translation. A lot of the time, women who aren't involved in these kind of organizations don't speak English and or don't have the language per se to get involved in these processes. It should be an acknowledgement that people shouldn't have to speak a certain way to be heard. So as I said earlier, involve women in the peace process meaningfully at every level and from the beginning. And what Yemen also needs moving forward is to be approached with nuance. There are many different actors in this war and many different dimensions to it. All must be acknowledged to achieve sustainable peace. I found with the Southern issue that people have a set idea of what people want and represent, and they will debate you based on what they think you think rather than what you actually say. And this is unhelpful. People need to be able to speak for themselves and be heard. There also needs to be acknowledgement that there isn't a simple, easily packaged answer to this war. Reaching a solution will require multiple complex approaches looking at every aspect of life in Yemen and centering marginalized voices. And kind of reiterating also what Samad has said is Yemen needs long-term solutions. Often there is so much focus on survival and the bare minimum, and I do understand why that is. The humanitarian crisis is real and severe, but Yemen also needs to be seen as a place where people can thrive and live full lives, and the international community seriously needs to internalize this. Imagination is important here. People should be allowed to dream. Many of the people I have spoken to in the diaspora and in Yemen do think like that about living freely in Yemen, but it's not reflected in mainstream conversations outside of Yemen. We can think beyond the survival as the goal, and we must. We must think about building infrastructure to make everyday life easier. We must think about a political future. We must think about how vulnerable groups factor into the future of Yemen and how they will be centered. Lastly, I know many people tuning in here will be from the diaspora. We need to ensure that we do not take up space or speak over Yemenis. We need to use our privilege to amplify the voices of those on the ground, especially the grassroots, and bring forward their issues to our representatives who often have a large impact on the future of Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. So last but not at all least, we have Fatma.
Thank you so much, Asman. Thank you, everybody, to all the panelists and everyone who is joining us today. I've heard so much today, and I initially wanted to talk about the peace process, but I also see more pressing issues on the COVID-19. And, you know, the one thing that maybe we need to clarify to the audience is that there isn't one single entity in Yemen that is responsible for a response for COVID-19. So as Nisma has mentioned, you know, in the Southern Territory, in Aden, for example, you have a conflict between the UN recognized government of Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi and the Southern Transitional Council, which is a group, a non-state actor that assumes the authority and actually has significant authority and backing in the south of Yemen. Then you have in the northern part of the countries, the Houthis, who are the de facto authority and have a unique way of responding. And chief in the response is a denial of the COVID-19 crisis and a suppression of these numbers. The Houthi Minister of Health has made a point to say, by disclosing the numbers, you actually create panic among the population. And this is equal to media terrorism. And we don't want to terrorize people by actually telling them what is the extent of this issue, when in fact, people are already terrified because they're burying their loved ones every day. You know, when the cemeteries are overflowing with bodies of people who died in mysterious circumstances. And as people mentioned before, there has been mass graves reported everywhere. And then in other areas like Ma'rib, Jauf, which are very loyal to the current UN-backed government, there is conflict between, I mean, actually this conflict did not exist before, or it's a result of the Houthi expansion. So the Houthis in the north are trying to expand their territory. They've launched recent military operations in this year. So populations who have been living in these areas, many of them, about 2 million of them, have been displaced as a result of the Houthis' monopoly of violence in the north. Now these people are finding themselves, them and others, and population in Al-Jauf and Al-Nahm, around 100,000 families had to also be displaced just recently in February. So if you could just imagine this, that 3 months ago, 4 months ago, people were living in their homes and then had to evacuate amid a COVID-19 crisis. So we have 3 authorities in Yemen: the Houthis, the government of Yemen, and the Southern Transitional Council. And each of them are have a unique response to the COVID-19 issue. With the Houthis, we've mentioned its denial. With the Southern Transitional Council, I think that, from what I have seen, they're relying on the community and they're being transparent in disclosing these numbers. The government of Yemen as well is being as transparent as possible, but it may not have the reach when you have the government itself situated outside of the country. I think the people in Yemen are trying their best. The international community is trying the best to help, but the lack of leadership, the lack of accountability is a constant problem in Yemen. And, you know, and when we talk about COVID-19 in a fragile state, it's really heartbreaking, because at the end, you know, rights, responsibilities, decent life, you know, these are things, people have no expectations of government anymore because they don't know who's the responsible authority. So, you know, is it all doom and gloom? You know, we have UN peace processes that are trying to help out with this. And of course, there's external interventions, be it from the region or from the United Nations, you know. So there's more than one actor in this conflict: the Saudis, the Iranians, the United Arab Emirates, and, you know, and of course, the other layer is with the international community. So just when talking about Yemen, it's really important to keep the end objective in mind, which is, how do we get peace for the country and lessen from the impact of the humanitarian crisis? How do we ensure that people who are living in the country are under control of different armed groups? How can they live a decent life? How can we ensure that they have equal access to basic services, you know, whether it's security or water or health and sanitation? But unfortunately, the peace pacts that we have seen in Yemen have been consistently failing. And what I am seeing today, you know, is unfortunately really troubling. Nisma Mansour mentioned the peace proposal that the UN Envoy's office had drafted, and you know, the Peace Track Initiative have analyzed the content of this peace proposal, and there has been so many worrying signs, because the proposal somewhat mirrors the same initiatives that had happened in the past, and we're not really learning from any lessons from there. So I'm gonna, you know, I'm gonna take you back just a little bit to 2011. 2011 was Yemen's most pivotal moment, in my opinion. It was the ouster of Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime, and, you know, this was during the Arab Spring wave. At that time, the biggest ask by the citizens was to have a more transparent and a less corrupt government. They wanted to have a more inclusive government. But the era post 2011, you know, although President Saleh stepped down peacefully after almost a year of protests, there has been a power vacuum that wasn't dealt with easily. The era after 2011 just ushered violent unrest, with a rise of terrorism and acute economic crises, and also just a deteriorating humanitarian situation, because at that time everyone was consumed with the idea of nation building, and they have forgotten basic bread and butter issues for the people. You know, they did not have the economic power and resources to help other people stabilize. And this has given opportunity for multiple groups to rise up and say, we've had enough, and we want to change the system, and we want to take this, we'll take this by our own hands. We're gonna change things by our own hands, because the transitional government is not doing much. And at that moment was the rise of the Houthis, which, as Samar Nasser has rightly said, that just triggered the violent conflict that we are seeing now today, and triggered the Saudi intervention, because the UN-backed government of Abdurrabur Mansour Hadi had said, we cannot face this alone, and we need Saudi Arabia's help to do this. with the Saudi intervention, that added a layer of grievance that has even complicated the situation in Yemen, and sort of added another obstacle towards peace. But prior to that, there was a UN process that had attempted to stem or to stop this deterioration of the country. So after the fall of Ali Abdullah Saleh, there was a national dialogue process, a UN-backed process. That's the first UN track that looked into stopping the conflict in Yemen, and it had generated a really inclusive dialogue process where different youth groups have participated, civil society, ministers, just people who wouldn't have otherwise met in regular circumstances. Despite the fact that it was good, it was just overly idealistic and did not manage to deal with the issue of spoilers. It did not manage to deal with the issue of greed or group grievance that had plagued the country, both north and south. And I think that, this had definitely led to the crisis that we saw, the Houthi takeover of the country, and the government just go outside into Saudi Arabia. But the other problem is, as we are continuing, or as the international community has attempted to lessen from the impact of this conflict and bring a solution, it had continued to do the same thing, which is provide overly idealistic solutions that are somewhat disconnected from the situation on the ground. So the second thing we saw, which was like two-piece efforts. One was in the Kuwait negotiation process and peace talks in 2016, that after 5 months of really solid negotiation ended up nowhere because the parties did not sign on the document. And then in late 2018, we had the Stockholm Agreement, whereby significant confidence building measures were proposed in order to just foster trust between the Hadi government and the Houthis. And the same problems continued because, ultimately it had sort of was introducing solutions and was completely disconnected from what was going on the ground. And there was also a lack of implementation for all of the articles that were agreed on. So for example, in the issue, one of the articles that was agreed on was to have a statement of understanding around Taiz, which is a city that is besieged by the Houthis. Fast forward till today, 2 years later, and nothing has happened. We haven't moved an inch on that issue. The issue of a ceasefire in Hudaydah, the ceasefire has meant different things for different people. And I think that at the time of drafting that agreement, for the Houthis, a ceasefire meant that the UN-backed government under the Saudis don't come into Hudaydah. But for the UN-backed government and the Saudis, it meant that the Houthis go back to Sana'a and just leave Hudaydah. So it meant different things to different people. But ultimately, when people say that the ceasefire is a success, it was a success in a way that it had stopped the UN-backed government from taking over Hudaydah. And this is a calamity for a lot of people who are still experiencing low-level conflict in Hudaydah every day. Are we able to solve the root cause of the problem is the question that we should always ask, and that's just not happening. With the leaked document of the peace proposal that's currently circulating, we continue to see the same problems, which is resorting to ceasefire committees or just committees to solve certain issues and work on confidence building measures. But all of these are really difficult issues to implement because the parties are not really agreeing on the ground, and we haven't seen any type of collaborative initiative that was not really heavily sponsored by any external power in Yemen so far that actually led somewhere. So all of this just gives me a little bit of doubt that we are using it's giving me a little bit of doubt in the peace process. I'm seeing that we are using just the same old methods to solve a conflict that is constantly evolving. For example, the Southern Transitional Council is a new player in Yemen's conflict, and somehow the UN peace process continues to sideline it and just pretend that it's not there. So just, I think that, in order to be able to help Yemenis find a decent life, there needs to be some type of acknowledgement of the role that Yemenis themselves play, and not just the warring factions. We need to extend this conversation and dialogue to civil society, thought leaders, local council on the ground, whereby they can help shape the trajectory for peace, because so far all of the proposals that we're seeing for peace are completely disconnected from what we're seeing on the ground. So I'll leave it there, and maybe other will participate more with the questions and answers.
Thank you very much. So I'd just like to say a quick thank you. There have been some great points raised, and I think we can jump straight to audience questions. So the first question that was submitted was by Gaisif Iryani. I'm going to paraphrase if you don't mind. So he's essentially asking that how can we talk about COVID-19 when we are just speculating? We don't have enough test kits. We don't know how many people actually have COVID-19. How are we, I suppose, able to talk about this constructively? Anyone can go for it.
I think I'll kind of start on this, and I didn't go into in depth regarding COVID, but and it makes sense. That question makes total sense. Because we don't know where we stand, how do we kind of approach COVID in that sense? I can tell you clearly that COVID has spread community level. I would, based on our local approach in Yemen, I would definitely say that it has reached almost every household, if not every other household. With that being said, testing is really important for tracing, right? That's the concept of testing, where you stand. Local leadership, they tend to trace. In Yemen, because we don't have that authority, there were multiple times where, for example, the STC in the south attempted to put some measures, but they could not actually do it. The government, I didn't see much from the government side regarding some policies and procedures for COVID. But the only thing which I think is a very big problem, the country is now depending on INGOs and NGOs to do the work for what is presumed to be government. And at the same time, we can't do that. There's no way. So I think we have to at least assume that it's spread based on the numbers. I'll give you an example. So in the city of Aden, before COVID, there was about 10 to 12 deaths daily regarding other natural causes or, other diseases such as cholera, dengue fever, things like that. After COVID, the numbers skyrocketed to 150 deaths a day. And that kind of shows you that COVID is there. It's there in strong presence. So we have to kind of take based on what we have and kind of, statistically approach Yemen in a way where it's actually spread. I always say at this point, testing doesn't matter for Yemen. A lot of people may disagree on that, but we're past that phase. The problem with Yemen right now is that when people do get sick, they don't have access to healthcare. They can't get to a hospital. I had a recent family member in Aden who passed away because of COVID, because she was turned down from hospitals and she actually died in her home. And that just shows you that we need to kind of reapproach COVID and say, okay, how can we support these hospitals, which Yemen is doing in the next few weeks. But the process is, it's not testing anymore. It's the depleted health sector.
I agree with Summer, and I would add that protecting the doctors is also very important, because most of them don't feel confident doing their job with very depleted PPE equipment. And just like, you know, when you don't have the gear, when you don't have the masks, when there's no sanitizers, there's no way that you could, you know, do your job confidently. And this is why people have been turned away, you know, consistently. The it is so unfortunate when, you know, the doctors are actually afraid of the patients at this time. They're taking a risk, and they're wondering, why are they taking the risk when there is no protection for them whatsoever? You know, and the other issue is also, many of these doctors are actually not being paid, and that's a calamity on its own. You know, what makes you get up every day and do your work if just, you know, you don't have the equipment, you're not being paid, and this issue is really not prioritized. The other, I'm actually slightly disappointed with the international response. So as Esma mentioned before, there has been a cut in aid, and there has been, you know, a recent aid pledging conference where $1 billion was pledged, but even that billion wasn't enough, because the need was double that. But still, we're not seeing that trickle down on the ground easily. So right now, it's just, you know, I mean, the WHO has provided certain testing kits, provided certain ventilators, but whenever I read, you know, it's just laughable. Like, you know, 4 labs for the entire country. At the beginning of the crisis, they wanted to be reassuring, and they said 400 testing kits. We have 23 million people in Yemen. So the numbers are extremely laughable in terms of the ventilators that are available, or the way that you can take care of the people. And, you know, this needs to be revisited. And I'm sure that health workers are doing so much and doing their best, but, you know, we could push to do a little bit more, in terms of even, you know, just looking at the issue of peace, and asking non-state actors to stop expanding and stop displacing people. And you know, this is a real worry. I mean, as I mentioned before, there are over 100,000 families displaced in Al Jouf and Nehem. These people need to return home. So at a minimum, even when we can't supply all of the kits and everything else, there needs to be a push from the United Nations to say, you know, safe passage needs to be granted for these people, and they need to be returned home. If there are areas that are under siege in Yemen, that siege has to end, and especially in Taz, where people need to have the freedom of movement to come in, go out, and just, you know, have access to medical equipment. Medical equipment has been blocked in the past in Taz. So there's a political aspect that needs to be thought through a little bit more carefully.
Okay, so if none of the other panelists want to add anything, we can move to the next question. So the next question was sent in by Felipe. His question is, how can we believe in a peace process in which, one, Saudi Arabia is used as an impartial third party when it is clearly an active part of the war? Two, a UN commission which has just removed the Saudi-led coalition from the child-killing blacklist, and three, if we continue to use the tag Iranian for Houthis, denying the complexity of the group and their roots in Yemen's recent history.
Can you just repeat the first part of that question? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So how can we believe in a peace process where Saudi Arabia is viewed as an impartial third party?
Okay. I think for me, one of my issues is that I don't believe in the peace process for these reasons of bias in multiple different ways. And I think what we can do as a community and as people who care about ending this war is holding the UN accountable and stating loudly that we can see all of these clear issues with the peace process and we aren't just going to let it go. And also that will kind of be demonstrated in the fact that these peace processes aren't going to work and there will not be peace in Yemen if this approach is continued. So I think essentially in terms of the question, I agree that it can't be trusted at this point in time, but there is work that we can do to impact it where we can and to raise the issues of who is being ignored and who is being given undue influence. And harking on to what I said before about the diaspora, use the power where you can, think about which country you live in and where you can hold power and where you can hold your representatives to account and ask them to represent the interests of the Yemeni people and to acknowledge these issues.
I would add something, if I may. Saudi Arabia is not part of the peace process. The peace process will have to be Yemeni, just Yemeni. And Saudi Arabia could provide a table, could help in the peace process, but ultimately, I think that the reasons for intervention are their own. There are various levels to this conflict. The first is Yemeni, and the second is Houthi Saudi. And I wouldn't even say Yemeni Saudi, but it's Houthi Saudi because the Houthis have expansionist aims that, every day, if you follow their news, they dream, their dream is to actually occupy Saudi Arabia, and it's they keep announcing that they have went further and further into Najran and other areas, and they've attacked Abha airport. So that's their own political objective, and I think that also complicates the war. So that's with regards to Saudi Arabia. And then with the child soldier issue, I have not really, maybe someone else who's more specialized in this can talk about this, but in looking at the child soldier issue, one of the biggest problems in Yemen is recruitment of child soldiers by everybody in the conflict. But what is of extreme worrying to me is mass recruitment and forced recruitment. So there are some who actually, join, children might be 15, 16, do not have national IDs, and they join the military for some economic benefit, which is unfortunate. But then my problem is when a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old is snatched from his home by an armed militia actor and is being forced to fight, and whether with money or with being paid or without being paid. There's a lot that is written there about the role of the non-state actors in recruiting, and especially with the Houthi militia, who feel that it is, the right of every person in the country to carry arms, including the children. And of course, there's a cultural aspect to this as well. I have spoken to some children who just wanted, yes, they were recruited by the Houthis, but they felt that they are really defending their country from what the Houthis have told them, where Saudis were invading and ISIS. So the Houthis are giving this narrative to the people, and a lot of the kids are really buying it, and they feel like they're subscribing to something that is bigger than themselves, and they feel a sense of purpose by being recruited, which is so unfortunate. The last question, I think you talked about Iran. Well, the Houthis they have links with Iran, and it's undeniable, and it's one that they are boasting. So if you go to Al Masira website on a daily basis, the Al Masira website is the Houthi TV channel, And in their webpage, the first news is Iran and Hezbollah news on a daily basis. So they identify as a proxy, I mean, they identify as an Iranian loyalist. They see that they hold more allegiance to Iran. And I think that this is counterproductive because for, you know, I mean, Yemen is neighbor to Saudi Arabia, to UAE, etc. I think it would be good to have good relations with Iran, but not ones that would cause instability in Yemen. And when we see Iranians' weapons that are being intercepted, and when we see Iranian missiles that are, you know, being used in the name of protecting Yemen, you know, we have to hold all actors accountable, not just the Saudis, but also the Saudis and the Iranians for what they're doing in the country.
I would like to take the chance to add more to the question, and there was also another question about inclusion and how to make the process inclusive for women and young people. So I will take the chance to answer them together. So unfortunately, as you said, as almost the panelists said, the UN led peace process have proved to fail since day one, from Kuwait to Geneva to Stockholm. People have lost their faith in this process, and also this process is continuing to repeat the same mistakes, not being inclusive also, and using the same failing methodology. As women, we have been since day one calling for inclusion, calling for using a different approach and settings for Yemen, but they no one there is no one that listens. I will give an example. In the case of detainees, well, we have that the mother of abductees, which is local Yemeni CSO working and releasing the detainees, was able to release hundreds of detainees, while the UN-led process for releasing the detainees has been suspended since December last year, since Stockholm. So on local level, women are doing a lot, and this is something I would like to highlight about the efforts of women on local level. So we at Peace Track Initiative, we are supporting one of the largest networks in Yemen, the Women's Solidarity Network, which has more than 270 members from different parts of Yemen, inside and in the diaspora. And our partners are doing a lot of local level peace building, from ending the child recruitment and negotiating for opening the corridors, and also ending disputes over water. And their work needs to be funded. But you see, on the other hand, that the UN is funding social media campaigns to support their ceasefire agreements. Don't get me wrong, the campaigns are good, but if you want the peace process to succeed, you need to be supporting those women on the ground who are doing the local level peace building. So yes, the peace process, unfortunately, it's not working, and it will not work unless it comes from down and it listens more to what really is going on the ground, and taking from the lessons learned on the ground. Because from a feminist and women perspective, women are already ahead of the UN in a lot of things, and we have our partner in Maghreb, Maghreb Girls Foundation, who have done kind of tribal agreement that the tribe will not send young men again to the front lines. So this is what I wanted to say. I will give the floor if someone wants to add.
I wanted to add one thing, and I think the really main problem, even since 2011, was all these agreements, whether it was the immunity for Ali Abdullah Saleh, which pretty much gave him the leverage to do what he wants, which is why he's eventually supported the Houthis, and eventually was killed by the same people he supported during the. One thing that I think, even if the UN does attempt to achieve, which I believe in, as you all can see, that Yemenis have felt complete zero hope from the UN, and we actually have the tone that they are part of the problem here, is that no matter what country or intervention or UN or whatever it may be, they will never be able to solve this crisis. Why? Because Houthis, this is based on the root crisis we're talking about. There is a racial aspect to this conflict. A lot of people don't talk about this. Houthis see everyone else in Yemen, pretty much, they're really the minority. I mean, maybe Fatma can kind of add on this. Probably 0.2% of population. I mean, it's just a very minimal number. On the news, they've kind of blew up in a way that they look like they're a really large group. They're not. That's number one. Number two, they believe everyone else is working-class citizens. We can talk about this in a way where they presented just recently a law of the five, which is a tax to support Hashemi families, a 20% tax, which support their families rather than the country. And so no matter what it is, it's purity. It is a very big problem. I mean, given my sociology background, I can actually equalize it to the Black Lives Matter movement versus white supremacy. It's the same concept. Or at least similar concept. They would rather, fight further, and that's what we're doing. And I saw in one of the questions, people need to step up. I'm sure Yemenis do. They're very resilient people. But how do you do that when there is armed groups in every street, every feet? Like, it's just so much pressure. And when they do speak up, they end up getting killed, kidnapped, tortured. I mean, the list goes on. So the conflict, to me, my worry is one day, and I always say this in every panel I speak to, one day this war will end. All wars end. That's just, it's history, it's fact. But at the end of the day, it is the internal crisis that worries me more right now. Because I can tell you this, the Western population all of a sudden got interested in Yemen when Saudi Arabia intervened, which is, they're absolutely right. I mean, there is a huge problem with that. But before then, nobody really cared and nobody really knew about Yemen. And so once Saudi Arabia does leave, which I think all actors should step away from putting pressure. All actors, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, whether it's for the support of the STC via UAE, Saudi Arabia via government, and Iran via Houthis, they all have some influence on them. No one can deny that. Payroll, it's with payroll, it's with politics, it's with residencies. I mean, we're in a very, very bad situation. So at the end of the day, I would love, maybe somebody later on can talk about this, is that no matter what solution comes up, there are grievances, there are racial issues, and there are an explosion of pushed away, problems for centuries, which equal to this conflict today. So it's just an explosion of many historical things in one right now.
Okay, perfect. So if no one has anything else to add, we can go on to the next question. Richard Saville says, how can one contribute or encourage political development when any engagement with the political process would undermine the charitable objects of humanitarian aid organizations? Would anyone like to tackle that?
So can you just repeat the question again?
Yeah, repeat the question.
So yeah, so how can one contribute or encourage political development when any engagement with the political process would undermine the charitable objects of humanitarian aid organizations?
It sounds like it's coming from the perspective of someone in a humanitarian aid organization. I would say if someone wants to support that, then as a small thing is supporting grassroots organizations and through perhaps humanitarian resources so that they can focus on the political conversation themselves. I think the reason I'm a little bit confused by the question is just that I'm not sure that humanitarian organizations that are external should be getting involved in the political development, but through providing humanitarian resources, they can perhaps make their lives easier for those who are doing that work and kind of amplify the people who are on the ground doing that work around rights and political development, that kind of thing.
I think it's a little bit confusing, but I think Richard is maybe he can clarify in the chat later on. He's saying that whatever happens politically undermines the charitable objects of humanitarian aid. So whether it's implementation and things, I'm thinking I would kind of maybe a little bit debate Nadia's concept of that we shouldn't, or humanitarians shouldn't get involved politically. While I do believe that is correct in terms of like the full-blown, political debate, anything they're synchronized. And I think, what happens politically impacts how humanitarian agencies do their work and vice versa. Actually, interestingly enough, when you actually look into humanitarian work, it's very much political. And unfortunately, we see that in many cases. And I kind of touched upon that earlier where, for example, I believe one INGO, no names, but one INGO claimed that the port of Aden cannot cannot process shipments quickly. So we're actually going to send it to the port of Hodeidah, which basically means that they're trying to give authority to other de facto groups. Even though personally, we have found, we send millions of dollars worth of shipments to Yemen, and I can tell you it's very much easy to go through Aden. But I think that political actors need to listen to humanitarian agencies. Just like, as Fatma mentioned, the humanitarian situation in Taiz is horrendous. There's no roads. And if there is one, if it usually takes 1 hour, it takes about 4 to 7 now to get transportation of aid. We've done a lot of projects in Taiz. We actually have an ambulance service in the city. And I can tell you that the amount of just challenge in that province is beyond belief, when it's actually, I believe, the 3rd largest population in the country. So, and Fatma had mentioned earlier that the UN could not even take solution or initiative to just this basic issue. And so again, we're leaving it, the UN is now leaving it to, and all political actors are leaving it to the people, which is much more riskier.
Yeah, I would add just, I'm sorry. Did you want to go ahead, Nadia? Well, it's not a secret, right? That David Beasley, the World Food Program chief, said that the Houthis were stealing aid, and that almost, just a substantial portion was going to their to the Houthis themselves. So. We saw in military fronts, food assistance was given to the fighters, the Houthi fighters, and corruption in aid happens in more than one area. This scenario keeps repeating itself. Where even with the World Health Organization. We've seen that some of the vaccines were intercepted, not delivered. Aid gets politicized, weaponized. This is a constant problem in Yemen, and the issue becomes later on is what percentage is acceptable, because ultimately you have to help the people. I think that a more rigorous mechanism in monitoring is needed, and more reliance on civil society in delivery is needed. And, you know, making sure that aid doesn't fall into the hands of non-state actors is really crucial. So I think there's a responsibility from the international community to ensure just strict monitoring procedure and oversight in any way that it can. There are local people on the ground who could be employed, hired to do this. You know, there are, you know, multiple mechanisms, whether in just like multiple aid modalities that could ensure that, you know, the margin by which non-state actor get these weapons or get this aid is limited. So I just think that we owe Yemenis more, and we owe the people of Yemen to help them and make sure that this money that was allocated and donated for them doesn't fall in the wrong hands.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add as well, I think I better understand the question now. I took it more as humanitarian organizations getting involved in political processes in a more direct way. But I do completely agree, which is why I said before that there needs to be a political solution to the war. And therefore, I also agree that humanitarian organizations need to be aware that there is what the politics is in the country and what is happening, who are the different actors, and how everyone in the country, how to reach everyone in the country and how to kind of get around things. And so, yes, they need to resist where they can, although I do understand that they have huge barriers facing them in doing this. But just to say that I do agree with what Samara and Fatima have been saying on this.
Thank you. So another question that's come up, which I think is kind of related to this. So from the Arab network at Singapore, so knowing that 90 to 90% of all Arabs in East Asia are of Hadrami origin, they've reached out and raised funds to buy medicines and PPEs, but they are struggling to ensure that their shipment actually gets to Yemen. So I think the question here is, how can the diaspora essentially reach out and help successfully and make sure that they can get help where it needs to be?
I'm really impressed with the Hadrami diaspora specifically, because I've seen so many documents and initiatives and really good studies that reflect the need on the ground. And they have the connections and they're resourceful enough to actually, you know, deliver aid. There's a huge Hadrami presence in also Saudi Arabia, not just in Asia. So there's in Saudi Arabia, they've actually been successful in helping and providing some of this. But I'm going to defer to Samar Nasser, because her organization actually delivers aid to Yemen, and they've recently had a huge shipment, like worth $1.5 million go into Yemen. So I think she's probably the best person to talk about this.
Yeah, I'm also very much impressed by the Hadrami community. Actually, I don't want to be biased, but my grandma's family side is Hadrami. But anyway, scratch that. It's very complicated, and that's the problem with kind of getting access to Yemen, is because of this conflict has created so much barriers to that. So for that gentleman, I would say that you do have to work with an organization that's licensed in Yemen to ensure that. We can talk about that if you send me an email, and I will make sure to assist you in that to kind of get everything done.
So another question that I thought was interesting, actually, because we've not mentioned it, is looking at Oman's proximity and sort of unbiased political position. It could have a huge influence on the peacemaking process. Would it be possible to do this in Yemen?
Sorry, to do what in Yemen?
Would it be possible for them to get involved in the peacemaking process?
What is the question?
I mean, it's about the Omani role. I mean, it's kind of interesting because really, let's just be clear. No one is really completely neutral and unbiased in Yemen's conflict. So everybody has their own agenda, and Oman is affected by proximity. It shares a border to Yemen and the south, and has certain links and interest in Mahra as well. And it had remained neutral in this war by not arming any of the actors and not siding with Saudi Arabia. Well, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has been neutral. However, it has provided substantial support for political parties, and has helped provide a, when I mean by substantial support, which is they have facilitated multiple talks, discussions between Houthis and the United Nations, Houthis and the GPC party. They're open to having all the multiple parties come and go into Oman and provide this platform whereby everyone can talk with certain safety and freedom in the country. So I think that role is crucial and continues to be praised. But ultimately, the answer to Yemen's problem has to be in with Yemenis themselves. They're the ones who have to come to a conclusion and they have to be honest with themselves about what they can give, and whether they can reconcile or not. And these reconciliation discussion have to start now, if not even 5 years ago. We have to be on this track. When I look, for example, at the Riyadh agreement, which is supposed to, or has come in November last year in order to stop the conflict between the Southern Transitional Council and the UN-backed government of Hadi, which is Saudi also backs. And I think the conflict, despite the fact that they're trying hard to patch things, if the solution does not come from the STC and Hadi's government, if there is no serious discussion that is led by the conflict parties, you can always bet that these talks are going to fail. I don't see that there is good intention on either of the parties to actually de-escalate, because for the STC, the reason why they're engaged in the Riyadh agreement talk is because they want to have a better position and more power and more recognition by the regional allies. And for Hadi's government, it's, multiple issues. They're forced to, because, I think they would choose war if they had a choice. They would choose war. But given the fact that they're not in the South, given the fact that this is a huge competing power, they choose to escalate, and it's all facilitated by the Saudis. So, this is why this doesn't give me a lot of hope when people talk about the Riyadh agreement or others, because there are some group grievances that are not being addressed, and the role of the regional allies, be it Saudi or Oman, continues to be limited if there is no serious discussion and a serious bottom-up approach that would involve civil society, the people who are affected, that would put a serious roadmap towards de-escalation. Otherwise, all of these, I call them fixer-upper solutions, are not going to be durable.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the fact that we're reaching the end of the discussion in terms of timing. So I think it's a good point to wrap it up here. I'd like to extend a massive thank you to all our panelists. We had so many questions. We apologize if we didn't manage to get through all of them. but I hope that, you know, this has been an informative and interesting discussion for everyone here, and that, you know, you've gained a slightly more nuanced and better understanding of what's going on in Yemen. So this is, I suppose, the end of our first online event at Cambridge University Yemen Society. Thank you to everyone who turned up. We really appreciate it, and we hope you'll join us in our upcoming events. So I will end the meeting now.
Thank you. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you all.